Josh and Frankie. What a couple of dumb shits.
Hello, Primates! You only make your first podcast once. You found Primus Tracks. Congratulations! There are many places to find Primus Tracks, including at Primus Tracks on Instagram and Threads. PrimusTracksPod@gmail.com is the email address, and there is a Facebook page appropriately entitled Primus Tracks. I am Josh, joining us from the 39th floor of Primus Tracks Towers. Primus historian of all he sees, it's Frankie.
Hey, Josh.
Hi, Frankie. We have quite an episode today. We're going a bit off the beaten path of music, as it were, to discuss a film. A film, you say? As you know, Frankie, I've seen over 240 of them. We are today talking about Electric Apricot, the band, the film, the phenomenon. It's a bit out of chronological order at first blush, as the movie and soundtrack were released around 2007. However, Electric Apricot has roots going back to 2005, Frankie. So we are including it here as we work our way towards 2006's Of Whales and Woe. But first, we have miscellaneous debris. What's going on in the world of Primus?
Incredibly exciting upload to YouTube. The first of what I assume, judging by the last names displayed on the screen, I'm guessing it will be a 9-part mini documentary about the process to select the new drummer for Primus. And today, the first episode featuring our pal Rory was uploaded. And I'm incredibly excited because our good friend Soya mentioned Primus Tracks. So that's our first official mention, like with our full name, an official Primus related thing.
So our friend Rory Dolan, our good buddy, auditioned for Primus. He's got this featurette, and Frankie's honing in on these 6 or 7 seconds right here.
Rory Dolan became a good friend in the Primus circle. They kind of befriended him through the Primus Tracks guys, who do a podcast about all the Primus music and stuff. And
thanks, Soya. That was phenomenal. Thank you, Soya.
So that's Frankie's highlight from Rory's audition tape. Is himself. No, it was. I will say that the first episode of this interstellar drum search was really well made. And
yes.
Beautiful, great. And the biggest surprise, of course, is there was great lighting as these guys were playing. So really fascinating look into the auditions. And it was just great to see our pal Rory in the room with Les and Larry jamming on some Primus and making some noise. So really looking forward to the entire series to hear how all those finalists were able to communicate musically, perform, and so on, and see this through. To their choice.
I mean, major props to Rory, because just looking at the episode, I felt so thrilled and excited for him, but I can't imagine how nervous he must have felt behind that drum kit when Les and Larry walked into the room. So I really admire Rory for pulling that off and performing so well during his audition. I know that my hands would have been shaking, I would have been sweating all over the drum kit. It would have been a catastrophe. So that speaks volumes about how professional and talented Rory is.
Well, you also are not a drummer, right? So it would have been an abject
I'm also
disaster.
not a drummer, yeah.
But yeah, point taken. Absolutely. Point taken. If you had been dropped into that drum kit, it would have been one of those nightmare scenarios where you don't know what you're doing. Everything's chaos and you're not wearing any clothes, you know?
Exactly.
One nugget that actually connects the drum audition to what we're talking about today in Electric Apricot, Frankie, is that Les Claypool was actually in both. No, it's that our pal Jason McHugh, who has been on the pod before, talked to us about the making of Electric Apricot. His name popped up in the credits as art director for the drum derby videos, that today's and the forthcoming ones. And Jason McHugh, of course, played a very important role in getting Electric Apricot off the ground. So it was really cool to see his name pop up in the credits again, working with Les and Company.
Super cool. Yes.
Absolutely. With that in mind, let's talk Electric Apricot. Now, we are not movie reviewers. We're not going to review the movie in terms of film and quality and narrative and so on. But we will give you a bit of a primer on it, especially if you are not at all familiar with the concept of Electric Apricot, which at the time, Frankie, I was aware of, but it largely went under the radar, I think. The film in general, although it certainly found its following pretty quickly. And then the limited number of gigs this fictional band actually did. So it did gain a bit of a foothold, but I recall just not being able to access the film because it wasn't playing at a theater near me. It actually had very limited theatrical release. And I never picked up the DVD. Now, there was a local record store promoting the release, and they had the little Electric Apricot stickers with the apricot and the lightning bolt. And I grabbed one on my way out the door, as well as a promo postcard. But I never went back and picked up the DVD. Now, of course, I've seen the film subsequently and own the soundtrack and so on and so forth. But at the time, I was just a budget-conscious graduate student. So it took me a while to actually see the film. When did you become aware of it, Frankie? Because in your timeline, you were well into your fandom.
Yes. I ordered the DVD probably around, could have been 2009, I guess. 2008, 2009 approximately. And when it arrived, I popped it into the DVD player. I watched it once. I don't recall if there are extras. I probably watched them as well. And that was it.
Yeah. There are some deleted scenes on the DVD, to my recollection of reading the features.
I became aware of it just because it was listed amongst all the things Les had done, and I was just grabbing everything chronologically.
Okay. So this was just an automatic purchase because it had his name on it.
Yeah, it was for completion purposes.
There's some territory to be mined here. The story of Electric Apricot, as far as the film goes at least, is quite interesting. And if you want more in-depth commentary on it, you can listen to our episode with Jason McHugh, which is way back in the list of episodes a couple of years ago at this point. And it was marked by all kinds of events that led McHugh to call the filming of the movie cursed. And I'm not going to catalog those today, but you know that when it ends with lawyers, it's cursed, and that this film ended with lawyers, unfortunately. And so Les is fond of saying he's still paying for this film, and I think that's what he means, because it ended up in litigation.
There are interviews where Les has said that the film kicked his ass financially.
Yes. Despite raising money to film it and get it out there in the world, he's still on the hook for probably mostly lawyer fees at that point, unfortunately. So as far as Electric Apricot goes, we're going back to 2005. And Les, an avid film buff and an idea man of sorts, had his own production ideas for years, Frankie, for films, movies, stage productions. One of those ideas for a film actually became a novel, South of the Pump House.
But it's worth saying that he had already dipped his toes into the director pool by shooting some music videos.
This is absolutely true. He had shot many a Primus video by this point and his own solo work videos. So he was certainly adept at being behind the camera and being in charge of everything. And so that first foray into screenwriting and trying to sell a film ended up becoming a novel, South of the Pump House. And a second idea was actually for a stage production about a jam band trying to find its way, and that quickly transformed into the mockumentary film Electric Apricot: Quest for Festeroo. There's all kinds of great details about this in the Over the Electric Grapevine book, for those of you who haven't checked that out yet, by Greg Prado. Great chapter on Electric Apricot, which is where I sourced a lot of this. The plot is a graduate student follows the band Electric Apricot as they seek a slot at a premier jam band festival. According to Les in the book, this whole idea stemmed from hanging with his brother-in-law, who was a theater director that is, in the Los Angeles area, and brainstorming his own stage production ideas. And as he noted, there was really no jammy, hippie send-up at the time, and Les had been in and out of that world, for a good 5 years at that point, and probably had a pretty good handle on it, being the perceptive guy that he is. And, of course, he knew the South Park guys. What better way to work those connections? Les relays his ideas to Matt Stone, one of them being this Electric Apricot thing, and Matt says, that's a good idea. And so he gets hooked up with Jason McHugh, and, of course, of Cannibal the Musical fame, and these guys just take off with this idea. Normally, there's a long gestation period for films. But as they chart it, they discussed the concept in January of 2005, and they were shooting just a couple months later in the spring of 2005. And Les had put together the band Electric Apricot in that time frame so that they could actually play gigs in the spring of 2005 into the summer. So this came together exceedingly quickly. In fact, they were shooting the film, Frankie, while continuing to raise money to shoot the film. So they're doing everything completely out of whack, out of order. Of course, you normally get your script, you get your production company on board, or studio or what have you. You get your funds, then you go shoot. They're doing all this in a different order and somewhat out of order, and perhaps that contributed to some of the cursed events of the film. We don't know. It came together pretty quickly, and I think the other thing was there was a lack of a script in the sense that they had ideas for scenes and they had seeds of where they wanted them to go, but the film was largely improvised, meaning there wasn't a full-on script, feature-length script, whereas as opposed to an outline. Now, you're walking a fine line, Frankie, in the world of film when you are when you're relying on your performers to improvise their way through a film, and that's going to be rough for even the most, or challenging, for even the most seasoned improv artists. But Les recruited Adam Gates, our good old buddy, Adam Gates, very funny man, Brian Kehoe, and Jason McHugh got his buddy Jonathan Cordy to round out the band. So we have Jonathan Cordy on keyboards, Adam Gates bass, Brian Kehoe guitar, and Les Claypool on drums. Frankie, we of course know he's a decent drummer, and was able to carry drum duties for this band. And I think they stated that they didn't want Les to be the frontman. They wanted it to be a bit less obvious, so they stuck him behind the drum kit.
That's why he's lapdog, right?
And the story of Lapland Lapdog Miklovich, which is a really funny name. They in the film, they reveal the origins of the nickname Lapdog. So for those of you who haven't seen the film, I won't spoil it. So once again, largely improvised, and Jason did tell us about the cursed production. It ends with a lot of legal wrangling with National Lampoon, as their CEO was charged with stock fraud. And then the next guy up was also charged with something. I don't even remember what. And so it ended with Les Claypool fighting for the rights to this film from National Lampoon, which was going under after a very short-lived revival. And, Les knew National Lampoon from the 70s, its glory days, and they had a lineup of people that were ready to bring that back. And then all of a sudden, those people were gone. There was somebody else in the office, and they were defrauding the company. Yikes. It starts with a germ of an idea that takes off quickly. They get the film made on a shoestring budget. They cut a bunch of songs with this fictitious band at Rancho Relaxo, do a handful of live performances. I would imagine mostly to get footage for the film. And then it ends with lawyers. Kind of a sad story, but also pretty much how most films end in some kind of litigation. So I also wanted to run down our cast because we have quite a cast, Frankie. I wanted to start with Cordy, Gates, Kehoe, and Claypool and the significance behind their character names. You might remember some of these. We talked about Lapdog Miklovich. Steve Gordo Gordon is Brian Kehoe. I don't know if that's a nod to Mike Gordon with that last name. But there's a pair of Steves in the band. There's Steve Gordon, portrayed by Kehoe, and Steve Iwas Trousdale, portrayed by Adam Gates. And he explains it in the film. Iwas is actually the name of an entity that Aleister Crowley was communicating with at some point, and that just makes perfect sense that Gates would use that in his characterization because we know about his fascination with the occult, going pretty far back. And that's been a recurrent theme through his work throughout the years. And he leans into it with this character. Also, the last name Trousdale, pretty clear for Primus fans, that Trows, getting a wink there. And I really like Cordy's character name of Herschel Tambor Brillstein. It brought to mind, there's a performer whose name, an old Yiddish performer whose last name I can't remember, but it was Herschel something. And actually, my mind went to Herschel Christofsky, which is Krusty the Clown's legal name from The Simpsons. Tambor made me think of Jeffrey Tambor, and Brillstein brought to mind Bernie Brillstein, a legendary producer and talent agent in Hollywood, whose name was all over the place for decades. There's little nods in those names. So Jason McHugh's character, Smilin' Don Kleinfeld, is a nod to Smiley, David Lefkowitz, but also to David Kleinfeld, a character from Carlito's Way, one of these guys' favorite films. And Soya had mentioned that to us years ago, Frankie, about the Kleinfeld. And of course, if you remember your Primus history, you remember that they were gushing about the health benefits of the Kleinfeld beverage in the late 90s. It's vodka and Red Bull. Not that great for you. Kyle McCulloch plays the shady financier of the record, Drew Shackelford. And Shackelford, for me, Frankie, brought to mind, I think, Rusty Shackelford, which was one of Dale Gribble's aliases on King of the Hill, if I remember correctly. Brian Kite played Dr. Brian Bucky Lefkowitz. So there's another nod to David Lefkowitz, the psychiatrist that they see in the scenes that are essentially a parody of the Metallica some kind of monster documentary where they're working with a therapist, in my mind at any rate. Some other familiar faces, Jason Thompson and Derek Walls, actual techs for Lesson Primus, are Electric Apricot techs. Oz Fritz is running the board in the documentary, as he did for Oysterhead and has done for a bajillion bands. And I got to give Oz credit. His deadpan is very good in this film. It's really funny. And then other characters are Arj Barker as the Cube. Sorry, his part's pretty funny. Seth Green and Matt Stone as the Taper guys, the very awkward Taper guys. Gabby Lala appears as May Pang, an obvious Yoko Ono send-up, who's paired with Iwas. And Sam Macaroni is the bartender who Kehoe punches. Steve Gordon punches. And Matt Powers, the man behind the camera for Blame It on the Fish, is the fictitious graduate student who is following Electric Apricot. There's also plenty of cameos throughout the film. Bob Weir and Mike Gordon, as well as Warren Haynes, make appearances. Bob's is pretty straightforward. I think Mike Gordon's is too, but they were able to warn Warren Haynes ahead of time so he could play it for laughs. Although he's pretty deadpan too, and pretty bewildered in his scenes, and I think that really actually plays to the tone of the film. So a lot of really familiar names and faces for those in the jam world, especially. And I think it was pretty clever to bring in guys like Bob Weir, to give some kind of, one reviewer said they brought these guys in for credibility, which I think makes sense. And I think they needed to do that because, Frankie, this is territory that had been mined before. For those of you who have seen Spinal Tap.
Spinal Tap, which is a masterpiece, by the way.
Absolutely. When you go into that territory, you're taking a risk, right? And a lot of reviewers compared it to Spinal Tap, some not so favorably, but it's in that realm, and so Spinal Tap is the inevitable comparison. The other one that I thought of was The Ruddles, which I haven't seen in years. I must have seen that in my early 20s, which is, of course, a parody of the Beatles and some of the documentary films about them. Eric Idle was the mind behind that. So those being the most well-known examples, and Frankie, this is just prior to the mockumentary format just blowing up on popular television with The Office and Modern Family and television shows like that. So Electric Apricot kind of slid in just before this format takes off on TV as well. I think they knew it would be tough for them to shake the comparisons to Spinal Tap. Jason McHugh even says in the book that they watched Spinal Tap really closely to make sure they didn't parallel or double any of the bits from that film, which is a great idea. So, it's an hour and a half. I hadn't watched it for a long time. Some brave soul uploaded it to YouTube recently. However, you can also find it on Tubi, as well as Amazon Prime, if you have a subscription to that. And Troma picked up the distribution rights to the physical media. You can pick up the DVD from Troma Film. I just checked, Frankie. It was $11.21.
Okay.
Deal of the century. Go buy out all the Troma DVD copies of Electric Apricot and help Les Claypool pay his legal bills. To me, Frankie, the best part of the film for me is the first half hour to 40 minutes because it starts so promisingly to me. There's this voiceover introduction. The main characters are introduced through all these quirky scenes showing their character traits and personalities. There's talking head interviews with people on the street defining the jam scene. And the best part is that in one of them, you can tell they're at a fish show. You can see the marquee behind somebody's head. So I think they're at the Warfield or something, just interviewing people outside in the line for fish. There's a lot of quick cut one-liners and gags in the first half hour of the film that are pretty good. There's a lot of standout ones. The offhanded comment about the "I Want a New Drug" by Huey Lewis and the News sounding like the Ghostbusters song, of course, like nice little reference. And Arj Barker as the Cube made me laugh. And you know what? Actually, that really hit home to me, Frankie, because Arj Barker as the Cube is saying, "Yeah, I'm on the rail, and I went to this show," and he's just rattling off all the shows he's been to. And I thought, oh man, that sounds like somebody I know. So it hit home for me. I went, okay, they're hitting these notes, right? They're the people that you find on tour or at these jam band shows. They did a really good job representing those in a pretty gentle way. I didn't see anything patently insulting, but then I'm not a member of the community. At the same time, it just seems like they were just given a gentle poke to some of these personalities. The Cube, the Tapers, so on and the band members themselves, really. So there's some funny bits. I love the repetition of the coffee house gigs that Iwas talks about. And then that this metal drummer Lapland shows up and his drum kit takes up the entire sidewalk. Cordy's character working in the coffee house is great because he serves coffee and hot chocolate to Chaney and Cage and Lena Claypool. They're on camera briefly, so they get a cameo. I think perhaps my favorite joke is the one that everybody always quotes, which is, "You only make your first record once," which is repeated a whole bunch of times. This is the first note of the first record, and so on and so forth. But I think a good under-the-radar joke is how Lapland describes how the lightning bolt on the Electric Apricot logo differs from the Grateful Dead lightning bolt, because it's got a different number of points on it. He's like, "No, that one's 13. This one's 11." So I like that little gag. Seth Green and Matt Stone played it up really well as the awkward Tapers. But there's points throughout the film where it just seems like the improv may have been a bit of a challenge for some of the guys in some of the spots, which, like I said, you got to be a seasoned improv artist to actually really be able to carry a scene. But I will credit them that they carried the film pretty far as essentially amateur actors. And that's pretty good. Like I give them credit for that. For me, it flattens out a bit when the narrative really kicks in. The shady financier of the record, using it as a cover for running drugs up I-5 into the Pacific Northwest. But it does have a lot of strengths. So I mentioned Adam's obsession with or fascination with the occult, shining through the Aiwas character. And actually a lot of the songs. I listened to the Electric Apricot songs that they cut at Rancho Relaxo for the first time in quite a while, Frankie. And like Yog Sagoff is all about this occult occurrence. And some of the music...
It's a 20-minute opus, by the way.
It is. And some of the music is actually reminiscent of some of the Madame Blavatsky Overdrive tracks that Adam would go on to record in the late aughts.
Yes, but Calling All Sandworms is my favorite.
Wow, shots fired. Calling All Sandworms, the electronic music track by Larry Lalonde, provided for this film specifically. What draws you to that beautiful track?
That it was created by Lur. That's more than enough for me.
I thought it was great too that Les realized, I have this scene in a club. I need electronic music. I'm just going to call Lur. And it worked out beautifully. I did note that one of the guitar squelches or sounds that you hear in Sandworms is quite reminiscent of some of the sounds he makes in Pilcher Squad. I thought that was interesting. I don't know if he directly sampled it or just kind of, made a sound that was reminiscent of it and tossed it in on the loop there. But that's something I noticed the first time I heard it. Yog Sagoff, like a lot of that music seems to bleed into Madame Blavatsky Overdrive. Now, all the Electric Apricot tunes are credited to all four band members. One of them, I think, Backroads of My Mind, has another person credited whose name escapes me at the moment. But that's in your soundtrack notes. And so they obviously came together to create these tunes, and all these guys have solid musical foundations and are able to, I almost use the word approximate, Frankie, but they create jammy tunes that are not too far off, and in many cases are spot on the kind of music you would hear if you were to go to a place like Festeroo. Now I have to ask you, Frankie, that brand of music, how does that resonate with you?
I enjoy Frog Brigade, of course. I love when Les jams with any of his projects. And because of Oysterhead, I guess I was curious about how Fish pioneered that scene. And I guess my limit was Grateful Dead because I couldn't get into that. I was also curious about what made them so legendary. And I watched a few performances, but to be honest, they were too mellow for me. I think Fish is more interesting, but definitely, if I'm going to listen to someone jamming, Les will be my go-to guy with any of his projects. Beyond that, I might check something out if I'm feeling curious, but I don't know. I guess I'm kind of accustomed to the way Les jams and how he cues the musicians so they go back to the original song, or I know when he's going to let the other musicians shine and when he's going to play a solo. After years of listening to him, I guess you become familiarized with those idiosyncrasies.
Yeah.
And that's why I enjoy the way he jams. Whereas with other bands, I'm completely in the dark to how they approach it. And I might enjoy it from time to time, but not always.
The good news is you have many entry points to Grateful Dead music. There are thousands of shows. There are some albums, but you could just probably pick a show. Or if you're on the street, Frankie, and you see someone in a tie-dye shirt, you can say, what was the best Dead show of 1985? And they'll tell you, it was February 26th in Fairfax, Virginia, and hand you the tape, and then you can go home and listen to it and judge for yourself. I don't know if I've mentioned him before, but my wife's aunt's late husband, was a huge Dead fan and showed me his tape collection of the live shows, and it was unending. And he had put on, a few of the shows, and I was starting to dig on it. Like, it was starting to make sense to me because he did actually kind of explain some of those elements to me, and it started to make sense. And of course, we were able to bond through Jay Lane's involvement. So because he knew who Jay Lane was, with his involvement with Rat Dog and Further and whatnot, Wolf Brothers, what have you. So we were able to kind of speak the same language in that regard. And then he could take my hand and guide me through. So I got a bit of an introduction. And of course, the Dead are kind of the gold standard at this point. And that shines through in the film too. In a couple of ways. Of course, Steve Gordo Gordon worships Jerry Garcia as a guitar player, and the Garcia tortilla part, it's pretty silly, but it tracks with that character. And of course, punching out the bartender for saying he was glad that Jerry died. So there's a couple of funny things in there, but even some of these Electric Apricot song titles are reminiscent of other song titles that people might know. And the one that jumped out at me was Uncle Pete's Party. The Apricot tune sounds a whole awful lot like Uncle John's Band, the Dead tune. So I think they were poaching some of those titles from some of these other ones, bands and song titles, to approximate them. And I think that works in their favor. Especially when you connect the dots to them explaining why the apricot lightning bolt is different and why these are original compositions and that they're their own musicians and so on and so forth, when they clearly worship some of these other musicians. And of course, that's a through line for Gordo when he is mesmerized by the presence of Warren Haynes. And of course, if you ever wanted to see Brian Kehoe's backside, this is the film. Forgot to mention that. I know that was a big draw for a lot of people, as he has his out-of-body experience near the end of the film. So there's a lot to like about this, but what I really appreciate is that they built an entire world. They make this film. They have this fictitious band that's actually a real band, that records a bunch of tunes at Rancho Relaxo and plays a handful of shows. We should take a look at the live history of Electric Apricot, Frankie. It's short, but it's there. Looks like there were 6 shows that they actually played in 2005. May 19th, Fairfax, Virginia. Sweetwater Saloon, May 25th. There's a whole bit about that in the Bob Weir Talking Head portion, I believe. And July 2nd at High Sierra Music Festival, August 23rd at the Joint in Los Angeles, and the next day in Santa Cruz at Moe's Alley. And then the following day, Wow Hall in Eugene, Oregon. These are all 2005. And then as per the book, they were slated to play at Shakedown Fest in Portland, Oregon on August 27th of that year. But that entire festival was canceled very shortly before it was set to take place. So no date there. So Electric Apricot gets 6 dates in 2005 and then a sole date in 2007 as the film was screened at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, which is a massive film and music festival that's held annually. And the band performed at Opal's Free House in conjunction with the screening of the film. And they performed the 5 tunes that you hear on the soundtrack: Burning Man, Sugar Train Blues, Uncle Pete's Party, Backroads of My Mind, and Yog Sagoff. Whew. And that soundtrack, by the way, hard to find, Frankie. I do have it in jewel case. It was distributed by Universal Music. And the CD contains all the Electric Apricot tunes, Calling All Sandworms by Larry Lalonde, as well as tunes by Bob Weir, Government Mule, Jerry Garcia, Michael Franti and Spearhead, and it kind of rounds out to a nice film soundtrack. And so maybe that soundtrack itself, Frankie, this right here, this CD is your gateway to the jam vehicle world. I don't know. It could be. Now, do you have the soundtrack on physical media?
No, I only have the DVD. Never got the soundtrack on CD.
You are telling me that I have something that you, Frankie Berestein, do not in the Les Claypool world of media and souvenirs.
That's right. But
wow.
while you were busy securing that soundtrack, I was busy scoring an Indonesian edition of the Brown album.
We'll call it a draw.
Priorities,
yeah. You could have dangled any piece of media in front of me to equal the Electric Apricot soundtrack, and you chose the Indonesian Brown album. So, as an overview, it's an entertaining film. People I know in the jam scene and around the jam scene really appreciated it for its take on the people and the culture and the music and the musicians. And once again,
yes,
I really
because,
do. Oh, go ahead.
I think you came across that sort of feedback because when I watched it, more than less mocking that scene, it felt like a celebration, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's much more positive. And the only people that really are portrayed to be not very smart are the band members themselves. So the joke's on them. They're the clueless ones, the self-absorbed ones, the passive-aggressive ones, and the guys who have no idea how to meet their goals and get in their own way. Everybody else seems pretty capable and knowledgeable, well-rounded individuals. Other than, of course, the drug runner that gets them arrested at the end of the film. And by the way, one of the arresting officers, Flouncin' Fred, in a wonderful legendary cameo. That's what I should have opened with when I saw Flounce at New Year's Eve. It's like, hey, aren't you that cop? So, just, as an overview, I agree with your take that it's a celebration of the jam scene, and the music and the people and everything that makes it what it is, because Les is, he's in that scene and of that scene for a while, has soaked it in and internalized it, and he's certainly profited from it. I don't believe at all that he's biting the hand that feeds. It does just feel like a lighthearted take on it, on a scene that quite possibly didn't have this kind of exposure or this kind of media, I suppose. So,
right.
As an outsider, it was pretty entertaining. Adam Gates is inherently hilarious to me, so when he's on screen, it's lighten up, because he's a really funny guy. So. It certainly has appeal for me. The jammy portions, of course, I was really unfamiliar with, except for the tropes that they play on. So there were probably some inside jokes that I missed. And so we should toss that out there. I don't know that we asked Jason McHugh about that, but we should toss it out to our erstwhile listeners. If we missed any of the really obscure or specific jam world jokes that were tossed into that film. But, layman's perspective, good for them for completing a film in what amounts to record time and getting it released and surviving the litigation and still having it available for distribution and viewing out there in the world. And I got to imagine that scratched the itch for Les. I don't think he's going to do that again.
No, it's off of his bucket list.
He had shot and marketed a pilot, a fishing show of sorts, right? With Diener?
Yeah. And he also expressed at some point that he was still interested in turning South of the Pump House into a film.
That's right. So maybe the door is not completely closed.
Yeah, the itch is kind of still there, but with completely different projects.
the lawyering probably soothed that itch for a long time.
Yeah.
Or distracted from it, more likely. But now that's fading, and so maybe there are some more screen projects that he'd like to pursue. But it is quite an accomplishment. And then when you look at and of course, as I do, Frankie, I watched the credits closely. There were a lot of other names popping up throughout the credits that you and I would recognize, including one Curtis Gomez.
CG.
Old CG was working some sound, I think in post-production or something like that.
Amazing.
On the credits. So, yeah, Les went to the Well of Friends big time for this movie, and it certainly paid off. So that's my summary of Electric Apricot. I know that we didn't want to get too much into detail for those of you who haven't seen it, because it's, films are an experience unto themselves. Sure, the film's been around for almost 20 years, but please don't ruin Citizen Kane for me, Frankie. I'm going to watch it one of these days.
Okay.
That's a joke. Rosebud! That beautiful sound can only mean one thing. It's time for Primates Takes. If you want your take on the track or album or movie, I suppose, that's up for discussion, all you have to do is go to patreon.com/Primus Tracks. The universal constant over there is Primates Takes. I put up the thread, you put up your opinions, and I read them right here. For Electric Apricot, Brooks, what you gonna do about it, Delight says, I always thought Sugar Train Blues would be a great addition to a Duo de Twang set list. It would have been a good one to twangify. Cam Covington says, when I saw the Frog Brigade during VIP, Les talked about the film a good bit. Fast forward to last summer, for the Primus VIP, I asked, will we ever see Lapdog on drums again? He didn't seem too enthused. I loved the movie. I first watched it around 2018 in college with some of my friends that are into jam music. Had no clue about the movie until then. I think Jordan wrapped it up pretty well. Speaking of Jordan, here's his wrap-up. Les documents not only his amusement with jam bands, but his appreciation for the scene that gave him a well-timed boost. With Primus sputtering, he pivoted to a rabid fan base and boundless musical exploration. It was a monumental development in his career, and big for us heads to be recognized with our own cinematic parody. And finally, Mickey Waters sent an epic Frankie email about his Electric Apricot experience. He says, I was living in Minnesota about 20 minutes south of Minneapolis-St. Paul when Electric Apricot came out. Lucky me, the theater 2 blocks from my apartment was showing it, probably for a day or two. So I obviously went. I don't know if it was the ticket taker telling me the wrong theater number or my dumb ass just going to the wrong theater, but I sat in an empty room for at least half an hour waiting for it to start. Of course, it was. When I made it to the right one, it was in the middle of the therapy session scene, so I missed the first half of the movie. Fast forward a year or two, I was seeing the Fancy Band. After the show, I was hanging out in front of the venue, and there on the ground was a copy of the DVD. Naturally, I snagged it and ran it back to my car. In retrospect, I should have asked if anyone had dropped it, but hey, I was in my mid-20s. I was so excited to see it all the way through, and it quickly became something I watched with all my friends on a regular basis. Also managed to find a copy of the soundtrack at a record store. No eBay or Discogs needed. About 5 years ago, I lent it to a couple friends who misplaced it. I ended up getting the Troma version of the DVD, but didn't like it as much because they took the golf scene out of the main film and put it in deleted scenes. Oh, that's interesting, Mickey. The golf scene has that moment in which Brillstein is having a hard day on the links there and says, I'm going to go burn some sage. And Lapdog says, I don't know about that. And in your soundtrack sleeve for the CD, one of Lapdog's turnoffs is burning sage. So there's another character note from the film. Thank you all for your Primates takes. So what are your major takeaways? You called it a celebration. Is this a film that has lasting impact and or watchability for you, Frankie?
I'll have to be honest and say that if you ask me about any album or any Primus or Les Claypool album, I've heard them thousands of times. If you ask me about Electric Apricot, I've seen it once.
Yeah.
So I don't know what it is about it that never drew me in that much. I guess um, I just care for the music a whole lot more than this project.
I wonder if it will allow you to enjoy the Electric Apricot songs coming back to this, because as I mentioned, I listened to them in preparation, and I was hearing some things that Adam Gates took with him, and I was hearing some less things too, albeit he was on drums, and hearing a lot of tributes, I suppose, to some of the greats of the jam scene, just by virtue of having 18-minute songs. So, really,
I did listen to the performances recently as I was going through the the live stuff on Toaster chronologically.
yeah.
So I did play all of those shows, and it's kind of interesting listening to the songs outside of the context of all the visuals.
Yeah, for sure. To hear those in isolation is interesting, and to put a through line to it, Frankie. The next record we're going to talk about coming up is Of Whales and Woe, and I would imagine the
Now,
Electric Apricot experience, in which Les was playing drums, rehearsing a lot on drums, recording these tracks, playing a handful of shows, that really warmed him up for Of Whales and Woe, and possibly allowed him to say to himself, I'll just play the drums myself, which he
now
does
Wilson
on many,
Woe,
many tracks.
now Wilson Woe is something that I'm truly looking forward to discussing. I adore that record.
We're definitely going to get to it one of these days. We got a few things ahead of that, but that is where we are slowly making our way. And so I think it is worth noting that Electric Apricot, I do think, allowed him, Les Claypool that is, to have a fresher view of his own tunes, having played some drums with Electric Apricot and then coming back to the bass as his main instrument for Whales and Woe, and messing around with songwriting and what that would sound like and feel like on his next record. So this is interesting, because this is a period of time, 2005, Frankie, in which Primus was on a break from two
But they
triumphant
did,
tours,
but they did perform.
and they did a show here and there,
Yeah,
but
but
Electric
it was
Apricot
but it was
certainly took up
barren.
all his time.
Yeah, it was
Um,
a barren land in terms of releases or new recordings, Primus wise.
Yeah, and I think I was out of the loop with this apricot thing, and then that we had to wait, and of course knowing it, to what they were up to, and then waiting a couple of years. Uh, of course, I think maybe delayed that gratification for a lot of people, and then for me, it just gave me an excuse to put it off even further. And so it took me a couple more years before I actually watched the film. I might come back to it in a few years. What I really wish I had done was, prior to the South Park show, I wish I had gotten out there in time to go see the screening of the remastered Electric Apricot, because Jason McHugh went through all that trouble to remaster it. He said it looked a whole hell of a lot better. I wonder if that affects the viewing of the film. Maybe I'll reach
That's
out to our
good.
pal.
That's good. He preserved it and took those measures to improve it.
Yeah, maybe that's what's on the trauma pressing. Well, Electric Apricot,
Hey, are you going to Burning Man?
I'm going to Burning Man, and you've been tracked. You can see Electric Apricot on Amazon Prime and Tubi through legal means. The DVD is distributed by Troma Entertainment. You can go find that at their website. And if you feel like watching it hot, go to YouTube. It's there. Soundtrack, CD, hard to find. You'll have to find it on a resale site. But that's the only way you can get your mitts on a pristine copy of Calling All Sandworms, Frankie's favorite track.
Which is a fabulous track, to be honest. It is my highlight of this whole thing.
Thank you very much, Primates. Thank you for indulging us as we discuss Electric Apricot, which to me stands as a curiosity of the Les Claypool career, but it certainly merited an episode. We'll see you next time. Later days.
Willie Mays.
Hey, are you going to Burning Man?
Hello again, Primates. Thanks for sticking around. I wanted to take the opportunity to thank our patrons who support us at patreon.com/Primus Tracks. I want to send a special thank you to our newest Primatrons, Harry, Breadnuts, and Joe T. Thank you guys for joining recently. Also want to thank Zach M., Brian Berge, Audrey Myers, Mike Taylor Mosier, Bryce Sherrill, Cam Covington, Mickey Waters, IDK Bai, Lance Halterman, Sachko, Tom Dastic, Brittany Ray, Edwin Allen Richards IV, our landed gentry, Matt Ray, Deluge Nuts, who makes me say that every time, Jordan Kahn, our resident fish expert, Matt Crakely, Trish, Less is More, Eric in Australia, Mr. Tamby Meatfoot, Brooks, What You Gonna Do About It Delight, Ryan Rashawn, Joseph Pebler, Nick the Dutchie, that's Nick in the Netherlands, Travis in Alaska #1, Stephanie Wolfgang King, Carl Reinsch, our spent poets expert, Travis in Alaska #2, and again, no idea which is which, Mike Chillian, Sarah Markham, Jesse Calton, Porter Kropf, Porter, Anthony Del Preet, go Bills, John Shreve, Johnny Perona, Mr. Funknificent, Johnny Coho, Stephen Stang, The Phantom Primatron, Simon Altman, also in Australia, Mike Tuckerman, Sculligan Val, Chris Gentile, Keith Thompson, Kevin, finally Swift, not that Swift, and El Patron Numero Uno, Carlos Arizmendi. Thank you all so much for your support. If you want to join the fun, it's patreon.com/Primus Tracks.
Burning Man. Hey, are you going to Burning Man?
Burning Man.
Hey, are you going to Burning Man?
Burning Man.
Hey, are you going to Burning Man?
Burning Man.